Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. This book tells in detail about the Muslim conquest of Spain under the Umayyad Caliphate from 711 AD to 718 AD. The conquest is also known as the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula or the Umayyad conquest of the Visigothic kingdom. This conquest destroyed the Visigothic kingdom and established the Umayyad wilaya of Al-Andalus. It also resulted in the expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Muslim rule into Europe. Start of Chapter 6. The Battle of the River Barbate. In the confined space between the lagoon of Janda and the foothills of the Sierra Momia, the Gothic army of 40,000 men prepared for battle. Its strength has been exaggerated by some Muslims and Christian historians to 90,000 and 100,000, while one Christian source has reduced it to a mere 25,000. We get the correct figure of 40,000 from Ibn Khaldun. It was a mainly cavalry force because cavalry was the dominant arm of the Goths, and it was largely a force of Visigoths, but with many Hispano-Romans of inferior status. It was a well-armed force. The better class of soldiers wore armor, and there were enough of these armored warriors to form the forward ranks of the army. The soldiers were armed with swords, lances, and bows, with shields for defense. In addition to these conventional weapons, many carried the heavy and much feared German battle axe, which was not easy to parry. But if in armament the Goths were terrible, in appearance they were otherwise. The knights were dressed in all their finery, silk and brocade with precious stones adorning their robes and weapons. Above their heads fluttered what looked like a forest of standards, giving the impression of a festive military parade. The status of every individual was known by his ring. Knights wore gold rings, other soldiers silver, while followers and slaves wore copper on their fingers. It was by these symbols, among others, that the Muslims were to know after battle the quality of the fallen Christians. The brightest in appearance, if not in spirit, was King Roderick himself. He wore a diadem of pearls, and a purple mantle bordered with gold embroidery covered his shoulders. The rest of his royal robes were studded with pearls and precious stones. The king was displaying all his regal accoutrements down to his sandals, which were worked in silver and carried their share of pearls and sapphires. His hands were encased in long felt gloves. The king took his place in the center of his army, sitting on what looked like a throne in a chariot drawn by two mules. Above his head stretched a silken awning to shade him from the midsummer sun, but he was not confined to his chariot. Beside the chariot, a groom kept the king's charger in readiness, a beautiful white horse named Aurelia, and some distance behind the chariot stood many mules loaded with ropes, which the gods hoped they would use to bind the captives they were sure to take. Roderick organized his army for battle according to the conventional pattern with a powerful center and two wings. The leading ranks were all cavalry, whose task it would be to assault and break the enemy front with shock action, a typical Visigothic maneuver. The king also maintained a sizable reserve located behind his center, for use as required in battle, while in front of him was positioned a strong bodyguard for his personal protection. The wings were formed of the divisions of the sons of the late King Witiza, and were commanded by those princes. These troops were no less disaffected and reluctant than their princely commanders. They had treachery in their hearts, though they did not see it as treachery. There is some confusion about the princes and whether they were in fact the commanders of the wings. Muslim historians have said that it was the sons of Witiza who commanded the wings and called them al-Mund, Olmondo, and Ardabasto. According to Spanish sources, the sons of Witiza who commanded the wings were Cisberto and Opas. Yet another Spanish historian maintains that Cisberto, who commanded the right wing, and Opas, who commanded the left wing, were brothers of the late king and uncles of the princes, that the princes were too young to command large divisions of the army, and were actually absent from battle. Opas, Archbishop of Toledo and Seville, was indeed the brother of Witiza. However, in order to accommodate the differing versions, it is assumed that the princes were in fact the commanders of the wings, with their uncles present beside them. The point is not a vitally important one. The general effect produced by the army of Spain, with its brightly clad and heavily armed soldiers mounted on their big, heavy horses, with banners flying and drums beating, was a very imposing one. To Tariq and his men the Goths appeared like an agitated sea. Tariq and his men were not overawed. For several months, advised by Julian about Gothic tactics, Tariq had trained his soldiers to fight in close, compact formations suitable for war against the Goths. This was not in the nature of Berbers who were used to a hit-and-run type of warfare, but they learned fast. Most of the men were veterans of campaigns fought against the Muslim Arabs. Most of the men would fight as infantry because there were only a few horses in Tariq's army. Numerically, they were less than 1 to 3 of the enemy, but they had the priceless qualities of toughness and valor and natural inclination to martial life, unspoilt by good living. It was a formidable army that Tariq commanded, 12,000 Muslims, mainly Berbers, with a few Arabs but several Arab officers like Mughis al-Rumi, Alqama and Abdul Malik. The noted Berber officer in the army included Tarif and a colorful chieftain named Usman bin Abi Nisa, Munuza, who was to play a prominent role in Spanish history in later years. There were also some Negro soldiers in the army. Their numbers have not been given, but from the part played by them in battle and the fact that they were used as a regiment, they would have been numbered in hundreds. The blacks were from Sudan. This name, meaning the land of blacks, did not signify the Sudan of today. It was used by the Arabs for the entire black belt of Africa, stretching from south of Egypt to the southern part of the present Mauritania. That is south of the present Arabic-speaking zone of Africa and including the present Sudan. These black soldiers were culturally less advanced than the Arabs, but as Muslims, they were as pure and devout as any, and braver than most. Tariq had chosen his position with great skill. His army was mainly an infantry army, more solid in battle, but lacking the capacity of fast maneuver. So he deployed it on a confined front of a little over 2 miles between the lagoon of Janda and the hills. His right flank rested on the foothills, and his left on the river Kelemin, beyond which lay the marsh. The battle would have to be a frontal one. This deprived the Goths of the benefit of mobility which they would hope to enjoy with all their cavalry. They were now denied room for maneuver, because neither the marshes nor the heavily wooded hills permitted free and easy movement by large bodies of cavalry. The Goths would be unable to develop their full power, unable to carry out fast maneuvers against the Muslim flanks. They would have to fight as Tariq wished, and Tariq had prepared his men to face frontal mounted attacks by the enemy, in close, compact units. We do not know the pattern of Tariq's deployment, nor who commanded what part of the army. He probably deployed in the normal pattern of a center and wings, but because of his numerical inferiority, he had nothing in reserve. He placed his black troops in the front rank of the center. He would remain on the defensive to receive and wear down his more mobile enemy, going on to the offensive only when the enemy had been seriously weakened. The Muslims awaited the start of battle in a mood of grim determination. They knew that it would be a bitter and bloody contest against a vastly superior enemy. They knew that there were no boats to carry them back to safety, that there was no getting away from the battlefield, that it was a fight to the finish, and they must win or die. If they won, Spain would be theirs, another land won for Islam, with a great deal of booty falling to their lot. If they lost and died, they would go to the paradise promised by Allah to the faithful. The Muslims looked at the splendid Gothic legions arrayed against them. They had no doubt that they would beat them. It was Monday, July 19, 711, Muharram 28, 92 Hijri. The day dawned cool and fresh with a clear blue sky, but it would get unpleasantly hot by the afternoon. This day would see the start of a week-long conflict. Roderick decided to initiate action. The onus of battle lay with him. Either he must fight a battle and destroy the Muslim, or they would remain indefinitely in his realm. Room for action was limited, and his cavalry did not have space to develop its full power. But they would have to do their best. The king did not intend a decisive action on this day. The Goths advanced with their massed cavalry along the whole front, but this was more of a probe to get the measure of the enemy and discover any weakness which could be exploited. Soon battle was joined. It began with light actions but increased in severity as the day wore on. The Muslims held their own and the Goths could find no weakness in the Muslim defense. Neither side gained an advantage, and neither side suffered much. This went on till nightfall when Roderick withdrew his troops from contact and re-established his position as at the start of battle. Most of the work on the Gothic side was done by the centre. As the next day dawned, Roderick threw his cavalry into a furious assault against the Muslim front. The Gothic cavalry, trained to attack and crash through by sheer weight of horse and armor, went into action in high spirits, but came to a grinding halt against the wall of Muslim defense. The two armies came together with a shock similar to two mountains dashing against each other. What followed was a day of horrors. The air was rent by shouts and screams from two great bodies of men as bold warriors struck at their adversaries, bringing down horse and man in a wild melee. The din of battle was increased with the blast of trumpets, the thunder of drums and the clash of hundreds of other instruments. The ground trembled under the tramp of the big European horses. Men fought with consistency in spite of the difference of more than 3-to-1 in strength. The battle which began at dawn went on with unremitting violence and carnage for the rest of the day. Prodigies of valor were performed by both sides. The Goths attacked with the grim determination typical of their race, straining every nerve to push the enemy back or break through on some part of the front. The Berbers fought with the wild fury of their race and the fanaticism of new converts to Islam. They stood firm as a rock, repulsing every attack, holding on to every inch of ground. There was no break anywhere in the Muslim front. Again no decision was gained, no advantage to either side. At last the coming of darkness put an end to the bloody slaughter. The violent spasm of combat spent itself, and the troops disengaged to reoccupy positions as at dawn. Both armies remained on the battlefield, while exhausted men got what rest they could. The Muslims spent the night in prayer, knowing that their ordeal had only just begun, and that what lay ahead would be harder still. Fighting would become more bitter and more bloody, but they had confidence in their own strength and courage, and in the skill and leadership of their commander. Patiently, they awaited the coming of the dawn. The Goths had got nowhere. The warriors had taken heavy losses, and the repulses they had suffered at the hands of the Muslims had helped neither their spirits nor their pride. But Roderick had reserves. He would use them to replace losses and augment the forces which had gone through 2 exhausting days of combat. The next day would see a repeat performance, but would end, Roderick hoped, with better results. The dawn of the third day saw a renewal of the cruel strife. The Gothic cavalry charged once again at a steady Muslim front, but once again the Muslims stood firm under the fierce attacks, giving as well as they took. The front gave no ground. The Goths were surprised at the solid firmness of the Muslim ranks, which was quite uncharacteristic of Berber warfare. The day had begun with fierce fighting, and the hard slogging continued with respite. Maimed and mutilated bodies overspread the earth as the frantic push of the Spanish army met with the stubborn resistance of the Muslim front. Attack after Gothic attack was repulsed, squadron after Gothic squadron thrown back. Men thrust and slashed and stabbed in merciless combat. The two armies went through the pattern of the previous day's fighting, again with heavy loss, again with no decision. Both sides showed courage and steadfastness, of which any army would be proud. Towards the end of the day, there was some slight advantage to the Goths, but not enough to make a difference. It was nothing that they could immediately exploit, and it came too late in the day. Again the fighting ceased without victory in sight. With the fall of dusk, another pitiless day came to an end, and the two armies disengaged for the night. It was a troubled Tariq who went over in his mind the events of the day. The Muslims had given way in places and yielded ground to the Christians. They were being worn down. The difference in numbers had begun to tell. While Roderick could replace his casualties with reserves and replace exhausted men with fresh troops, Tariq could not. The same men had to go on day after day with the seemingly unending nightmare. He noted a certain amount of disorder. His men were showing the effects of fatigue. The knowledge that the Christians would come again the next day, and that they would again have to go through a day of horror, while they stood on the defensive, which was against the nature of the Berber, was not good for the men. The Muslims were still brave and bold, but a decline in spirits was clearly discernible. Tariq decided that he would talk to the men. He rode to various parts of the front, got the men together, and at each place, rising in his stirrups, he addressed his warriors. After praising Allah and beseeching Him for victory, this is what he said: O men, where can you fly? Behind you is the sea, before you is the enemy. By Allah, there is nothing for you but faith and perseverance, and these cannot be overcome because they are victorious forces which suffer not from lack of numbers. Know that you are on this island like unwanted orphans, and an enemy advances against you with an army, and weapons, and ample provisions, while you possess nothing but your swords, nor any provisions except what you can snatch from the hands of your enemies. Banish fear from your hearts. Lo, I impose no task upon you from which I shrink, nor will I lead you upon a course which endangers life, but I shall offer myself first. Whatever I do, do you also. When I attack, you attack. When I stop, you stop. Be like a single body in combat. As soon as battle is joined, I shall attack the tyrant of this nation and either kill him, God willing, or die in the attempt. So attack with me. His words had an electrifying effect. The men forgot their fatigues and their wounds. In the words of a chronicler, the winds of victory began to blow over them. They replied as one man, We are with you. We will be ahead of you in battle. Tariq had hardly ended his tour of the battlefront, exhorting his men, when God showed his favor to the Muslims in an unexpected manner. The defection of the faction of Witiza came to a head. The sons of the late king and their followers had had enough of battle. They came to realize that by fighting on they were unwittingly contributing to a victory which would perpetuate the rule over their country of one whom they regarded as a hateful usurper. They decided to act now. The princes sent agents to the Muslim camp to see Julian and convey through him the following message to the Muslim commander: Roderick is a dog from the dogs of our father. his follower and servant, who usurped the throne after his death. Further, they offered to desert the Gothic army in the morning with their followers and come over to him. All they wanted in return was his protection and a promise to hand over to them the estates of their father, which had been seized by Roderick. These crown lands consisted of 3,000 choice farms, which were to become known as the royal portion. Tariq accepted the conditions. Plans were made to exploit the defection of the Spanish wings when the Muslims launched their decisive, all-destroying attack in the morning. Tariq's plan was a double envelopment combined with a powerful frontal attack. First, the Muslim wings would attack the opposing wings and drive them off the battlefield. The Gothic wings would in any case not need much persuasion to abandon the main body of the army, even if they did not come over to the Muslim side. Then the attacking wings would close in on the Gothic flanks, while Tariq struck frontally against the main Gothic position. The final phase of battle would be a three-pronged attack from front and flank. The Muslims would be in the same battle formation as before, except that the battle troops were shifted from the center to the left to face the Gothic right. Tariq would himself lead the center, mounted on his horse and accompanied by a group of picked warriors also on horseback. The sun was not yet up on the fourth day of battle when the Muslim wings moved from their positions. The Goths were taken aback by the Muslim initiative because they had not expected it, and it is unusual for infantry to frontally attack a cavalry force. Moreover, this move upset Roderick's preparations for his own attack, which he had hoped would be final and decisive. But the Goths were brave warriors and stood to receive the attack. As the Muslim wings neared their objectives, the Gothic wings turned and bolted. They did not come over to the Muslims as the princes had promised. They just turned and rode away, leaving the Gothic flanks open. Roderick may have had his suspicions about the loyalty of the sons of Witiza and expected such an event, because he responded very quickly to the new situation by ordering his reserves to take the place of the deserting wings. But the move was late and inadequate, and gave only partial cover to the Gothic flank. Now Tariq ordered a frontal advance and the main body of the army heaved into action. Soon battle was joined. The Gothic front held, but the Gothic reserves attempting to establish new flanks were driven in by the Muslim wings, with the result that the Spanish army found itself under attack from front and flank. Yet the Goths stood their ground. As the day wore on, the fighting became more severe. It increased in intensity until it was even more violent than the fighting of the day before. Muslim assaults became bolder and fiercer. Hundreds of Goths fell under their blows, but the center continued to resist. They struggled desperately to stem the advance of the Berbers, paying heavily in blood for the time gained. For hours the two armies were locked in mortal combat, striking with sword and battle-axe, while the air resounded with the clash of steel. The carnage was fearful on this fourth day of battle. At last, the Muslim wings closed in from the flanks as the Muslim center closed in from the front in the last sanguinary phase of battle. Tariq wore a coat of mail and had a white turban on his head. His guards were dressed in similar manner. All were armed with swords and lances and bows. Tariq and his guards spurred their horses and made a determined dash for the Gothic center, where Roderick could be seen sitting on his throne on the chariot, overspread with a silken awning. The Muslim group crashed through the guards in front of Roderick and made for the king of the Visigoths. It is said that when Roderick saw them, he exclaimed, "This is the picture we saw in the enchanted house in our realm," and Tariq shouted, "This is the tyrant of the enemy." According to some accounts, Tariq charged at Roderick and killed him as he sat on his throne. Most historians, however, discount this and give the more likely version that the king quickly changed to his white horse and galloped away. But more of Roderick later. With the flight of the king and the death of many of their generals, the resistance of the Goths weakened. As the Muslims struck even harder, a rearward movement began in the Gothic army, which became faster as disorder increased. The movement soon deteriorated into a retreat and a general exodus from the battlefield, and this in turn deteriorated into a rout as the Christian front disintegrated. Before long, the Goths were in full flight with the Muslims close upon their heels. We pursued the fugitives for 3 days following that of victory, Tariq was later to write to Musa, without lifting our swords from the necks of the vanquished. The Goths thought now only of saving themselves from the horror which pursued them. Some escaped into the hills, where they could not be easily followed. Most of them fled along the roads and tracks which took off from the battlefield, and for 3 days the Berbers came in close pursuit. The Muslims struck their adversaries down left and battlefield, and for 3 days the Berbers came in close pursuit. The Muslims struck their adversaries down left and right, their swords drinking deep of Gothic blood, and turning a once proud Gothic army into a terror-stricken rabble. They had taken a large number of horses which the Goths had ridden into battle, so that now every Muslim was a mounted warrior, which facilitated pursuit to the dismay of the fleeing Christians. The Battle of the Barbate was over. It ended on Monday, July 26, 711, Shawwal 592 Hijri, lasting a week of which 3 days belonged to the first phase, the fourth to the Muslim counter-attack, and the last 3 days to the pursuit. Adding a day for the return and reassembly of the Muslim forces takes us to the traditional Monday to Monday duration of 8 days given by Muslim historians. No one quite knows what happened to the ill-starred king of the Goths. Some claims made by later Western writers that he escaped with his life and fought another battle with the Muslims are untrue and are discounted by most historians. On the bank of the river Barbate, the Muslims found the white horse Aurelia which the king had used in battle. Beside the horse, embedded in the mud of the river bank, lay one of the king's sandals, studded with pearls and sapphires, which was later sold for 100,000 dinars. Roderick's body was never found. The general consensus is that he drowned in the river, weighed down by his heavy armor, while trying to get away from the battlefield. A great and terrible battle had been fought, a great and glorious victory won. The powerful army of Spain, led by the ablest general of Spain, had been shattered in battle by a Muslim army less than a third its size. The proud Visigoths had been made to bite the dust. Never before had the Goths been so badly beaten, so thoroughly defeated in fair combat. This was one of the decisive battles of history, perhaps the most decisive ever fought in Spain. There would be other battles in the peninsula in the blood-soaked history of Spain, but never one so bloody, so fiercely contested, and so far-reaching on its consequences. It was a stupendous victory for Islam. It marked the beginning of the end of Gothic rule and opened the doors of Spain and Western Europe to Islam. The plain of the Barbate bore gruesome evidence of the ferocity and carnage of this battle. The earth was covered with broken swords and lances, with broken and torn bodies. An enormous number of Goths had been killed, whose bones would lie glistening in the sun for many years. While there is no record of Gothic losses, it is reasonable to assume that their casualties were at least the same in proportion to their strength as those of the Muslims. Thus about a quarter of the army perished in battle, perhaps 10,000 men, most of whom fell in the main battle, while others were cut down in the pursuit. Among those killed was Cisberto, brother of King Witiza, and commander or second in command of the right wing. The Muslims took 10,000 prisoners who, according to the usage of war, became slaves, except for those who accepted Islam, as many of them did in due course. The Muslims lost a quarter of their strength, 3,000 dead, martyrs in the way of Allah. and since the ratio of wounded to killed in battle is usually 3-1 and 4-1, there must have been few warriors who did not carry wounds on their persons. But a glow of pride warmed their hearts. They had fought and defeated a superior Gothic army in typical set-piece Gothic fashion, which was far from the Berber fashion of hit-and-run warfare. The booty collected was immense. After taking out 1/5 of it as the share of the state, Tariq distributed the rest at a scale equivalent to 250 gold dinars per head. This was a classic battle, following a pattern now well known. A smaller force of infantry, lacking the capability of fast maneuver, faced with a much larger and more mobile force, restricting the field of battle to a narrow front and robbing the enemy of its advantage of mobility. The smaller infantry force lacking the strength to attack remaining on the defensive to receive the attack of the larger force. A smaller force of infantry, lacking the capability of fast maneuver, faced with a much larger and more mobile force, restricting the field of battle to a narrow front and robbing the enemy of its advantage of mobility. The smaller infantry force, lacking the strength to attack, remaining on the defensive to receive the attack for the larger force, wearing down the large forces to create conditions for a counter-stroke. The smaller infantry force going on to the offensive when the enemy has been weakened and bled in repeated repulses. The final attack in the form of a double envelopment, combined with a frontal assault. It was a beautiful battle, brilliantly conceived, superbly conducted, and heroically fought. In general concept, it was similar to the Battle of Cannae fought in 216 BC, at which Hannibal did much the same to the Romans as Tariq did to the Visigoths, with a portion of strength only slightly better than Tariq's. Cannae has given its name to this type of battle maneuver. One could ruminate further on this fine battle, but it might be better to let the student of war indulge in the exercise of his own judgment in evaluating this operation. A good part of the credit for this victory goes to Tariq, whose skillful tactics and bold leadership made it possible. It was under his command that his fearless Berbers planted the flag of Islam on Spanish soil, where it would flutter in joyful pride for 8 centuries. It should be noted, however, that they came, fought, and conquered not as Berbers, but as Muslims, purified and inspired by the new faith. As soon as the fever of battle had passed, Tariq wrote to Musa bin Nusayr. He narrated the course of battle and how they had pursued and slaughtered the Goths. The glorious results gained from the battle included the ample spoils of war. He had the right to expect applause from a grateful commander-in-chief. What he received in reply was a rebuke. Musa warned him against any further advance and ordered him to remain in his present. End of chapter 6.